Picture this. A young woman, barely 22 years old, walks away from a comfortable home in Ontario, a promising engagement, and every reasonable future anyone could have wanted for her, and boards a ship bound for the interior of China. No mission board has sent her. No church has commissioned her. She has simply heard something in the night that she cannot unhear, and she has decided that obedience costs everything or it costs nothing. Her name is Nora Calloway. Most people who knew her in those early years in Brantford, the neighbors, the women from her mother's sewing circle, even the young man she left behind, would not have predicted this. Nora was quiet in the way that people sometimes mistake for timid. She sat near the back of the church. She did not raise her hand when the visiting evangelists asked who felt called. She helped in the kitchen after Sunday service and did not make speeches about it. What was happening inside her, she kept largely to herself. But something had been building since she was a girl of 9, the year her father read aloud from a magazine about the inland provinces of China, the villages where no missionary had ever walked, the people who had never once heard the name of Jesus. Nora had listened from her place on the rug by the fire, and something in her chest had tightened in a way she could not explain. It was not sorrow, exactly. It was not excitement. It was more like the feeling of recognizing something you did not know you had been looking for. She did not tell her mother. She did not tell anyone. She just carried it. Years passed. She finished her schooling, learned to type, helped her aunt run a boarding house for a season. She got engaged to a steady, decent man named Arthur, who worked at the mill and attended church faithfully, and would have made a perfectly good husband. And all the while, quietly, in the room she shared with her younger sister, she was reading Missionary's journals, letters from the interior, Hudson Taylor's biography, worn to softness at the spine. She read the way a person reads when they are trying to talk themselves out of something, and into something else at the same time. The night she finally decided, she was 21. She had been praying, not dramatically, not with any particular sense of crisis, just the ordinary evening prayer of a young woman asking to be shown what was right. And in the stillness after she had said amen, she had the clearest thought she had ever had in her life. If not you, who will go? She did not sleep that night. By morning, she had written a letter to a small faith mission she had read about, asking if there was a way she could be of service. She did not tell Arthur. She did not tell her mother. She told them 3 months later, on separate occasions, and neither conversation went well. The ship that carried Nora Calloway to China left Vancouver in the autumn of 1911. She stood at the stern and watched the coast of British Columbia disappear into the gray November water. And she thought about Arthur's face when she had finally explained, the way the hurt had moved across his features like weather, slow and total. She had not cried during that conversation. She cried now, alone at the railing, because there was no one watching and because she thought she had perhaps earned it. She arrived in Shanghai with $37, a trunk of Bibles and medical supplies, a letter of introduction to a missionary couple in Hunan province, and almost no Mandarin. What she had was a stubbornness that she had always thought was a flaw. The quality that made her finish every book she started, even the dull ones, that made her stay at a task long after anyone sensible would have stopped. In the years ahead, that stubbornness would be the single most important thing about her. The missionary couple, the Hendersons, received her kindly enough, though it was clear from the first week that they were not quite sure what to do with her. She was not, strictly speaking, under any organization's authority. She had no institutional backing, no regular income, no plan beyond arriving and being useful. Mrs. Henderson, a practical Scotswoman who had been in Hunan for 14 years, sat Nora down at the kitchen table their second week and told her plainly that China was not a place for sentiment, that the work was grinding and slow, and that most people went home within 2 years, and that she hoped Nora had thought this through. Nora said she had. What she did not say, because she barely had words for it herself, was that she was already in love with the place in a way that disturbed her. The narrow streets of the market town, the smell of charcoal and rain, the sound of Mandarin all around her, which was still just sound, but which she was already beginning to hear as something she needed to understand. She had begun to learn. She sat with a local teacher for 3 hours every morning and studied in the evenings until her eyes blurred, and within 6 months, she had enough language to hold a simple conversation. And within a year, she was preaching in it. The village she settled in was a 3-hour walk from the nearest town. It had no name in any Western record. The people there had seen perhaps 2 or 3 foreigners in their lives, and they regarded Nora with a mixture of suspicion, pity, and fascinated curiosity. She rented 2 rooms in a farmhouse from an elderly widow and set up a small clinic of the most rudimentary kind. Soap, bandages, basic medicines she ordered through a network of mission contacts. And she began to visit, not to preach, not at first, just to visit. She learned who was ill, who was grieving, whose children had fevers, whose crops had failed. She sat in courtyard after courtyard and drank tea she could not identify and listened with her imperfect Mandarin. And she treated what she could treat, and she left without making demands. This was not strategy, not exactly. It was just the only way she knew how to be. But in a region where missionaries were often viewed as agents of foreign power, and there was good reason for this view, given the history, Nora's way of simply being present without agenda was unusual enough that people noticed. The first person who came to faith in that village was a woman named Lynn, a farmer's wife in her 50s whose daughter had been very ill and whom Nora had nursed through a long fever. Lynn was not by temperament a person easily moved. She was practical, even blunt, with a sharp eye for pretension. She had watched Nora for months. The early mornings Nora spent in prayer, the way she treated the poorest families with the same care as the headman's household, the fact that Nora seemed to have no interest in converting anyone, and yet clearly believed something with her whole self. Lynn had asked her once directly, "What is it that you believe?" Nora had answered for an hour. Lynn had listened, and something had opened. This was not a revival. There was no moment of mass conversion, no dramatic healing service. It was slow and interior and personal, one person at a time, over years. Nora would have been the first to say that she was not the reason for any of it, but she stayed. That was the thing. Season after season she stayed. There were years of illness. Nora contracted typhoid in 1914 and nearly died. The Hendersons, when they finally reached her, found her alone in her 2 rooms, delirious, with no one to attend her except Lynn, who had stayed faithfully at her bedside for a week. When she recovered, thin, shaky, slower for a time, she wrote a letter home to her mother in Brantford that managed to make it all sound ordinary. She did not want to frighten anyone. She also did not want to go home. There were years of difficulty with the mission structures that had grown up around her work. By 1916, Nora had a small network of house gatherings across 5 villages, a school for girls that she ran out of a converted storage building, and a loose association with 3 other women workers in the region. She had done all of this without institutional backing, funding herself through the irregular donations of Canadian churches who had somehow come to know about her, through letters that circulated in a way she had not planned or sought. It was not, by any measure, a large work, but it was a real one. The problem was that Nora was a woman working alone, in authority, over a growing community, in a part of China where the larger mission societies had their own ideas about how things ought to be organized. She was not ordained. She was not under anyone's oversight. She preached, which some considered improper. She made decisions about the life of the small church communities in her villages without reference to any board or committee, which others considered reckless. There were letters, careful, concerned, well-intentioned letters, suggesting she might consider coming under the umbrella of one of the established missions. Nora considered it. She prayed about it for a long season, and in the end, she wrote back and said, with all the gentleness she could put into the words, that she did not believe she could serve the people in her villages and serve a denominational structure at the same time, and that she would continue as she was. This cost her. Some of the financial support dried up. Relationships with missionaries she had respected became strained. A woman who had been her closest colleague in the region left to join an established mission and was replaced by no one. For 2 years, Nora worked entirely alone. She did not write about this period much in her letters. Years later, after she was gone, a small collection of her journals was found in the farmhouse where she had lived, and in them she wrote about those years more honestly than she ever had to anyone. She wrote about the loneliness of waking up in the dark at 3 in the morning and having no one to tell about the fear. She wrote about the theological arguments she could not have with anyone because there was no one around qualified to have them with her. She wrote about missing, achingly, specifically, the sound of Brantford in winter, the particular creak of the floor in her mother's kitchen, the way the light came through the east window in the morning. She wrote about the days when she wondered whether she had misunderstood something fundamental, whether the clarity she had felt that night in her room as a young woman was something she had manufactured out of her own longing. And then she wrote about what she did on those nights. She prayed, not eloquently. She wrote that her prayers in those years were barely language at all, more like sounds than words, but that she brought herself to God as she was, and did not try to make herself more presentable first. She wrote, "I have nothing to offer this but my being here. I hope that is enough." It is the most honest thing anyone who knew her ever said about her faith. And it comes from herself. The transformation in the region came slowly, and then faster, and it was never the kind of thing that made it into any report. It was not Nora who recorded it. She was constitutionally opposed to keeping statistics about spiritual matters, which frustrated the people who later tried to write about her. What we know comes from others, from the journals of a Canadian doctor named Leonard Marsh, who passed through the region in 1923 and wrote about finding in a cluster of villages in rural Hunan, a community of perhaps 200 people who had come to faith over the previous decade, who met in homes and a small building that had been built by the people themselves, who sang hymns in Mandarin and read scripture aloud in a way that suggested long practice. He wrote that the woman who had founded this community was a person of extraordinary ordinariness. She met him at the edge of the village, wearing a worn padded jacket and mud-caked boots and carrying a basket of medicines. She shook his hand and asked what he needed. He said he was a doctor. She said, "Good. Come with me. I have 3 families I need your opinion on." He spent 4 days in the village and left, he wrote, feeling that he had been in the presence of something he could not exactly name, something that had more to do with sustained faithfulness over time than with any particular gift or calling. He did not see what Nora was like at the end of those days. He was already gone by then. What she was like in those years was tired in a way that sleep did not entirely touch. The work had grown beyond anything she had imagined or planned for, and she was still, essentially, alone in it. She trained local leaders as fast as she could, handed over responsibilities, tried to build the communities so they could stand without her. But she was still the one who made the journeys, still the one who settled the disputes that occasionally arose, still the one who sat up through the night when someone was dying. She had given everything she had, and she had done it for so long that she could no longer entirely remember what she had been like before she gave it. She did not complain about this. In her journals she named it, clearly, without drama. She was exhausted. She was sometimes lonely in a way that felt cellular, not situational. She had made a choice years ago that had foreclosed certain other choices, and she had made it with open eyes, and she did not regret it. But she was honest enough with herself in those private pages to say that not regretting something does not mean it doesn't cost. She never married. In the early years there had been 1 or 2 men, a medical worker who passed through, a Canadian pastor who had written her letters for a year that had grown increasingly warm in tone, but nothing had come of any of it, and after a while, the question had simply ceased to be a live one. There was no dramatic reason. There was just the work and the life she had built, and the realization, at some point she could not precisely identify, that she had become someone who was suited to what she was doing and would not have been suited to something else. She wrote about this once. Just once, in a journal from the late 1920s. She wrote, "I think I was always going to be here. I think this was always what I was for. I am not unhappy. But I am aware tonight of everything that happiness did not include." The last decade of Nora Calloway's life was marked by increasing physical difficulty. The years of hard living, the fevers, the inadequate food during lean seasons, the unrelenting pace, had taken their toll, and by the mid-1930s she was visibly diminished. She was thin in a way she had not been, and slower, and there were days when she did not leave the farmhouse. But she did not stop. She wrote letters, Dozens of letters, hundreds over those years, to every community she had touched, to every leader she had trained, to young people in Canada who wrote to her asking about missionary work. She prayed. She read. She studied the Psalms in Hebrew, which she had taught herself from a grammar book during one of her seasons of isolation, because she felt she was not understanding them deeply enough. The communities she had built were, by this point, largely running themselves. This was what she had always wanted, and she felt the satisfaction of it. And also, she admitted in her journal, a particular kind of loneliness that comes with becoming unnecessary to the thing you have given your life to build. She wrote, "The work is the proof that I was here, but there is no one left who needs me to be here, and these are not the same." She died in the winter of 1938. She had asked, in a letter written 2 years before, when she was already aware that she was declining, that she be buried in the village. The people there had built her a simple grave at the edge of the field, where she used to walk in the early mornings to pray. They buried her there, and they remembered her in the way that communities remember those who have been so long present that their absence feels like a change in the weather. No official mission society sent a representative. No denomination claimed her in their records. There was no obituary in the Canadian papers. A short notice appeared in the bulletin of a small Baptist church in Hamilton, whose congregation had supported her sporadically for 2 decades, and that was all. A woman who had known her for the last years of her life. One of the leaders Nora had trained, a woman named Wei Fang, who by then led the community in the central village, said afterward that Nora had seemed, in her final weeks, at peace in a way that was not resignation but completion. That she had asked, the last time Wei Fang visited her, whether the young people were still meeting on Thursday evenings, and that when Wei Fang said yes, Nora had smiled and closed her eyes and seemed to need nothing more. This is the thing about Nora Calloway that is hardest to get across in any telling of her story. She was not trying to be remarkable. She was not building a legacy. She was not, in any sense that she would have recognized, pursuing greatness. She heard something when she was very young that she could not unhear, and she spent her entire adult life trying to be faithful to it, in one corner of one province of a vast country, with no audience, no recognition, and no certainty that she was doing it right. She paid a price for this. She was lonely. She was often afraid. She was sometimes unsure. She gave up the ordinary life that would have been given to her. The husband, the children in the backyard, the kitchen in Brantford, the Sundays at home. She gave all of that up, not because she found it worthless, but because she found something else that she valued more. And she held to that thing with both hands in the dark through decade after decade, because she had decided it was worth holding. The communities she helped to build are still there, changed by time, reshaped by history, living in ways she could not have predicted, but present. What's stopping God from using you the way He used Nora Calloway? The brokenness, the weakness, the ordinariness? She was all of those things. She just refused to let them be the final word. If this story moved something in you, the story of an ordinary woman who said yes and kept saying yes until her last breath, stay with us. We have more stories like this one. Men and women whose names never made it into the history books, whose lives were spent in the quiet, unglamorous work of faithfulness. We think those stories matter. We think they might be the stories you need most. And if you've been feeling lately like you might be hearing something you can't quite unhear, pay attention to that. Nora Calloway did.